committee chamber was steady, polished, almost boring. Then Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, sharper than the microphones could handle, and cut John Kennedy off mid-sentence. "You don't get to talk about my heritage." The word heritage snapped through the room like a cracked board. Aides froze. Reporters looked up. The interruption wasn't a correction, it was a barricade. Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't even look annoyed. He reached into his folder, pulled out a sheet of paper, and set it flat on the desk. "Senator," he said, voice calm, slow, deliberate. "I won't. I'll let your words do it." And then he began to read. "Like and subscribe." Because the moment he reached the end of that line, the chamber didn't just pause, it tilted. Some hearings simmer. This one boiled in seconds. The chamber was meant to be routine, flags draped in quiet authority. The seal above the dais looked more symbolic than watchful. Staffers lined the walls with legal pads and water bottles, already resigned to hours of dry testimony. It was supposed to be one of those sessions that generates transcripts, not headlines. Elizabeth Warren sat poised, her stack of notes layered with highlights and sticky tabs. She had a reputation for precision, statistics like arrows, charts like maps, footnotes that never missed. She looked like she could deliver her opening statement without ever looking down. Kennedy, by contrast, looked underprepared. One legal pad, one pen, one folder so thin it could have been empty. He fiddled with neither. He just sat back, glasses low, the way a country lawyer would lean on a porch railing before asking a witness one question too many. The chair droned through the formalities. Jurisdiction, respect for process, the usual script. Senators nodded along, each waiting for their soundbite. Warren's aides leaned forward eagerly. Kennedy's aides leaned back, as though they'd been here before and already knew how it would go. For the first 20 minutes, the rhythm was predictable. Warren answered with long, precise sentences. Other senators traded in talking points. The hearing glided like clockwork, until Kennedy adjusted his mic and asked quietly, "Senator Warren, can we talk about how we present identity to the American people?" The words weren't even out before Warren leaned across her desk, her voice sharper than her tone usually allowed. "You don't get to talk about my heritage." The interruption sliced the room. Staffers' heads snapped up. Aides froze with pens half to paper. The moderator blinked, gavel half raised, but unsure whether striking would make it worse. Warren didn't just interrupt. She planted a flag. It was hers, and she dared him to cross it. Kennedy didn't bristle. He didn't smile. He just lowered his eyes to the folder in front of him, opened it with the slow patience of a man in no rush, and slid out a single page. He set it square with the desk, tapped it once with his pen, and looked up. "Then let's let your words speak," he said. And the gallery, which had been scribbling like normal, stopped entirely, because everyone knew the room had just shifted from testimony to theater. Interruptions can block arguments, they can't block paper. The room had already tilted, but it didn't know by how much yet. Warren's words still hung in the air. "You don't get to talk about my heritage." It was sharp, protective, and final, or so it sounded when she said it. But Kennedy's calm was the kind of calm that tells you he's not arguing. He's waiting. He lifted the page like it was light as air, but the silence around it made it heavier than iron. The header caught the camera lights. It wasn't some mystery document. It wasn't a leak. It was something worse. For Warren, it was her own words. "Senator," Kennedy began, slow, careful, like each word was being pulled from deep water. "These are not my opinions. These are your statements, public, printed, and plain." He read them, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, each phrase unrolling across the room like a rope being measured foot by foot. The words were familiar to those who'd followed her career, but hearing them back to back in Kennedy's drawl, stripped of her cadence, they sounded less like a defense and more like an exhibit. Warren shifted, cutting in, "That's not the context." Kennedy didn't look up from the page. "Then let me add the context. Same source, same interview, same date." He turned the sheet over, showed the timestamp in bold. "I don't need to editorialize, Senator. You did the work for me." The gallery shifted in its seats. Reporters leaned forward, pens suspended, knowing they weren't taking notes anymore. They were catching the line they'd be writing into headlines tonight. Warren tried again, louder. What you're doing is playing politics with identity. Kennedy set the page down, folded his hands. No, ma'am, what I'm doing is reading. He let the words sink. And sometimes reading is more political than talking. The audience didn't clap. They didn't gasp. They didn't even move. They just listened, which is deadlier than noise, because silence means the words got in. A producer in the gallery whispered to another, "This is the clip, right here." And in that instant, the interruption that was supposed to stop Kennedy had opened a door he wasn't going to close until he'd walked straight through it. A page doesn't need to shout. A date stamp does the shouting for it. Kennedy didn't raise his eyes yet. He let the sound of his own reading fade, then lifted the page until the masthead and the date caught the overhead lights. A timestamp does what no speech can. It fixes memory. It says, this was said, here, then. Reporters in the gallery tilted their lenses. The word October gleamed. AIDS scribbled in margins. Everyone knew what it meant. The contrast wasn't abstract anymore. It was on paper, signed and dated. Senator, Kennedy said, voice even, you said one thing here. He tapped the date at the top. And another thing there. He tapped the second page waiting under his hand. He didn't accuse. He didn't editorialize. He just placed the 2 points under the same light. The silence wasn't respectful. It was surgical. The crowd leaned in, not because they agreed, but because they couldn't look away from the gap Kennedy had just pinned open. Warren pushed back, sharp, almost clipped. That was a different context, Senator. Identity isn't a line item you can cherry pick. Kennedy finally looked up, glasses low, gaze steady. I didn't cherry pick, ma'am. I read. And if context changes the words, then folks back home will want to know what changed, the truth or the telling. The gallery murmured, a ripple, not a roar. Enough that the chair raised a gavel, then lowered it again. Even he knew that hammer would only echo Kennedy's point. For the first time, Warren's hand shifted across her notes, flattening a page, pressing it as if smoothing fabric. The cameras caught it, the audience noticed. Because sometimes the body says more than the mouth. Kennedy tapped the date once more, quieter now, almost casual. People don't grade you on abstracts, Senator. They grade you on months. And October doesn't look like Julie. A hush heavier than any shout settled over the chamber. Not applause, not outrage. Just the weight of a sentence that makes every other sound irrelevant. A pivot is supposed to change the subject. But sometimes it just changes the audience's patience. Elizabeth Warren wasn't new to being pressed. Her whole career had been built on absorbing attacks and turning them into lectures. So when Kennedy laid down her past statements with dates, she did what she always did. She pivoted. Senator, she said, leaning toward the mic, we can spend all day on semantics, or we can spend our time on policy, the real issues, wages, housing, education. That's what the American people care about, not whatever selective quote you're trying to twist. It should have worked. Normally it does. The audience usually follows the pivot because they want the relief of moving forward. But not this time. The silence in the chamber wasn't ready to budge. Too many had already heard the words Kennedy read out, and the words had landed like nails in wood. Kennedy didn't rush. He let her pivot stand in the air, brittle, unsteady. Then he leaned forward, eyes on his legal pad, voice still steady and low. Senator, I don't disagree with your list. Wages, housing, education. Lord knows those matter. But when you tell me not to speak about something, and then I find that very something written in your own words, dated and clear, it doesn't look like policy. It looks like a double standard. And folks at home don't forgive double standards. The gallery shifted. Reporters scribbled. The pivot had cracked. Warren tried again, voice quickening. Identity is complex. You cannot flatten it into a sentence just to make a point. Kennedy's reply was almost a whisper. I didn't flatten it, Senator. You did, when you wrote it down. The words dropped like a hammer muffled in cloth, quiet but final. For the first time, Warren sat back instead of leaning forward. The pivot had run its course. It didn't carry the room. It didn't erase the page. It just circled back to silence, and that silence belonged to Kennedy. Some moments don't wait for the transcript. They leave the room while you're still talking. By the time Warren finished her pivot, the gallery had already moved on. Not from the topic, but from the hearing itself. Because in the back rows, producers and reporters weren't scribbling policy notes anymore. They were marking timestamps. "Clip it from the interruption," one whispered. "No, start when she says you don't get to talk about my heritage." Another leaned over, eyes still on Kennedy's folder. "End it right when he says, 'These aren't my words, they're yours.' That's the package." Phones were out now, not just notepads, not surreptitiously either. In plain view, the little red dots of recording lights glowed. Staffers noticed. A few shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to stop it, because everyone knew the clip was gone already. Once those dots blinked, the story had slipped its leash. Kennedy sat unmoved, calm as a bench in the park. He didn't try to ride the moment, didn't push it. He let Warren's frustration echo against the silence. It was like watching someone lean harder into a swing that had already lost momentum. Meanwhile, across town, newsroom interns were splicing captions onto raw footage before the chair had even moved to the next question. Side-by-side graphics were being built. Warren cuts in, Kennedy reads her words back. By evening, the lower thirds would be ready, the hashtags already seeded. Warren pressed forward with statistics, her voice regaining volume. But the problem wasn't her delivery, it was the oxygen. The oxygen in the room had been stolen by the interruption in Kennedy's reading. Everything else now felt like aftersound. In the back, one aide muttered to another, "We lost it. That's the headline." The other didn't argue. They just closed their laptop with a sigh. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, folded the page neatly, and slid it back into the folder like a craftsman putting away a tool. For him, the job was already done. The hearing might still be running, but the story was already playing somewhere else. Shouting wins seconds. Silence wins history. The chair tried to drag the hearing back to life. Another witness was recognized. Another question read off the paper like a grocery list. Numbers about appropriations, references to statutory language. On any other day, it would have landed with the dull thud of routine. But not today, because the silence left behind by Kennedy's reading was heavier than the questions being asked. It was the kind of silence that doesn't simply exist. It competes. Every statistic Warren laid down sounded like a whisper against the echo of her own words being read back. Every pivot toward policy felt like a detour when the audience still remembered the main road. Reporters in the gallery weren't writing policy anymore. They were writing atmospherics. Warren bristled. Kennedy leaned calm. The room froze after the page. Words like tense, charged, icy slipped into draft leadies. The story wasn't about appropriations. It was about interruption and silence. Warren answered questions cleanly, her cadence precise, her volume steady. She didn't stumble, but cameras don't always follow stumble. They follow energy. And the energy had shifted to Kennedy's folder, even closed on the desk, like a loaded pistol no one wanted to acknowledge. Staffers on her side knew it. One aide scribbled furiously on a yellow pad, emphasized growth change, circling it twice. Another whispered to a reporter, "She's moved on." But the reporter only shrugged. Moving on doesn't mean the story comes with you. Kennedy didn't speak again for a long stretch. He didn't need to. He sat back, glasses low, nodding occasionally as if satisfied to let the room carry on around him. But the silence around his earlier words clung like smoke. And that was the moment Warren couldn't shake. Interruption is loud. Silence is louder when it follows you home. The interruption was loud. The close was louder, without raising a voice. The chair gavelled the session toward conclusion. The sound flat, tired, more formal than firm. Staffers began stacking binders. Aides whispered logistics about exit routes. Reporters typed fast enough, their keyboards became a background hum. It looked like the hearing was ending. But Kennedy hadn't moved. He sat with his folder tucked neatly under one arm, glasses low, expression unchanged since the first interruption. The silence around him was the same silence that had haunted the chamber since he read her words aloud. Steady, heavy, immovable. He rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and looked not at Warren, not at the chair, but at the seal above them all, the record that would live beyond either of them. Then he turned just enough for the microphone still hot to catch him. "Senator," he said, voice even as gravel underwater, "I didn't write those words. You did. My job wasn't to argue with them. It was to remember them." He closed his folder. He left the desk. And that was it. No flourish, no rebuttal, no need. The sentence didn't need a reply because it already had one. The silence that followed. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. The interruption trended first. But the replay, the cold close, outlasted it. One interruption, one page, one sentence that didn't need an exclamation point. Was Kennedy right to read Warren's words back? Or did he cross the line? Tell me in the comments below. And don't miss our last video. Bernie Sanders calls Kennedy a fraud. Kennedy brings up his investments. That one set the internet on fire, and it's on your screen now.